early Sunday morning. I was not comfortable in heaven and decided to return to Jerusalem. I avoided Saturday. Nothing much happens on the Jewish Sabbath, and I was too full of my own grief to be able to cope with that of Jesus' earthly companions. I arrived in the city as the Sabbath sun was setting and people were emerging from their homes to resume their business. I toured the city, searching for a familiar face, and eventually found Mary of Magdala with some of the other women who had supported Jesus. They were at a market buying grave clothes and burial spices. I did not know what had happened to Jesus' body after his death. Clearly there'd not been enough time to complete the customary burial ritual before sunset and the start of the Sabbath. I searched Mary's mind for information about Jesus' body. Then I left the market and followed the trail of Mary's memories. I made my way past the place where Jesus was executed. The crosses had been removed. All that remained of Friday's grisly events were 3 pools of dried blood. I moved on. A little way further I came to a small hillside garden where there was a tomb carved into the rock. Their garden was heavily guarded. There were 2 very different groups of guards. At the entrance of the garden and beside the tomb itself I found a detachment of Roman soldiers. The other guard was made up of opposition spirits. The latter noticed my arrival but ignored me. They were confident in their victory and knew that I presented no threat to them. Unseen by the Romans, I settled myself down next to the vast circular rock that blocked the way to Jesus' empty corpse. Through the night, the Roman guard changed at regular intervals and several opposition spirits passed by to see where Jesus' story had ended. As the sky brightened and the birds resumed their morning calls, my thoughts were interrupted by the sound of laughter. The laughter was neither human nor demonic. It was the unmistakable laughter of heaven, and it came from inside the tomb. My spirits suddenly soared, and the opposition guards froze. They stared through the rock in disbelief and then fled without a backward glance. I stayed, enchanted by a sound more welcome and more beautiful than the song of any bird. It was a laugh that I instantly recognised. The wholesome mirth of my boss. I leapt up and listened, excitement flooding my spirit. Beside my boss's life-restoring delight, I could hear a chorus of thousands, even millions of other voices, all joining in the ecstatic cacophony. Then, without warning, the laughter stopped and a single voice penetrated the solid rock between us. It was a human voice, but richer and fuller than any human voice I'd ever heard before. It was the voice of Jesus. "Come on, Oriel, let us out. It's rather crowded in here." "There's a guard of Roman soldiers," I replied. "What shall I do with them?" "Oh, put them to sleep or something," he suggested. "But hurry up, I'm getting squashed." I dealt with the soldiers quickly and turned my attention to the stone. Moving rocks around is not something that archangels do very often, so I studied the rock for a while, heckled by amused voices from within. Lucifer and a detachment of his key henchmen arrived, but I ignored them. They presented no threat now. They didn't stay for long. I moved the stone slowly, being careful not to break it. When it was finally out of the way, I was astounded by the sight that greeted me. I'd expected to see the sun return to his usual heavenly form, sharing inseparable unity with my boss. But there before me stood Jesus the human, although he was far more than human. The hazy form of his physical humanity had been transformed into the full beauty of heavenly life. I was dazzled by his appearance. "Out of the way, Oriel," he called exuberantly. "There's a lot of us in here." I stepped aside, and out of the tomb came my boss, followed by a long line of bright, shining humans, the first of whom was Jesus. "Who are all these?" I asked the son, who stopped beside me. "All the people who have died, who have ever loved me," he replied. The heavenly humans emerged from the tomb in a steady stream, all following my boss. "Is there anyone left in death?" I asked. "Sadly, yes," Jesus said. "There are those who still insist on going their own way, even when offered complete forgiveness and a timeless life." His thoughts were distracted by the sight of someone entering the garden by the traditional route through the gate. "Quick, Oriel," he said. "It's Mary. I don't want her to see me yet. You'll have to deal with her." "What should I tell her?" I asked. He was gone. As soon as they rounded the corner of the path, Mary of Magdala and her companions discovered that the tomb was open. I do not think that they could see the continuing stream of redeemed men and women. As all of death's former prisoners had now had heavenly bodies, I suspect they would be hard for human eyes to see. Mary walked straight past me, and stepping over the sleeping Romans, she stooped to look into the tomb. To her it was dark and empty. She conducted a thorough search of the stone slab where Jesus' old body had been placed on Friday evening. While she was discussing her findings with her friends, Gabriel, Raphael, and Michael arrived. The news had reached heaven. I quickly explained the situation to them. "What should I do?" I asked. "I'll leave it to me," Gabriel replied. "I'll talk to them." "Don't frighten them, Gabriel," I warned. "They've had a traumatic few days." "I've done this before, Oriel," he retorted. "I know," I said. "That's why I'm going to join you." Together we thinned our spiritual beings until our brightness was reduced to the narrow spectrum of light that human eyes can see. The women were terrified and fell flat on their faces. Gabriel gave me a resigned smile. "They scare easily, these humans," he said. I spoke to the women. "Why are you looking for a living man in this place of death?" This seemed a strange thing to be saying, considering the long queue of very much alive humans who were still filing past us. Gabriel added excitedly, "Jesus isn't here. He's alive." I cast him a slightly impatient look, asking him to leave the talking to me. "Don't you remember what he told you while you were still in Galilee?" I continued to the women. "He told you that he would be arrested and killed, and he also said that on the third day he would rise again." They nodded their heads as the memory rose sketchily in their minds. Suddenly, something clicked into place in Mary's thoughts. "Come on, girls," she said to her companions. "We must run back and tell the others." And off they went. One of them, Joanna, I think, turned and called out, "Thank you," as they disappeared. Gabriel and I, returned to our usual brightness and were joined almost immediately by Jesus. "Where were you?" Gabriel asked. "Behind that rather large cedar tree," he replied, pointing with a human arm bright with heavenly light. "May we ask why?" Raphael added tentatively. "You may," Jesus responded, but with the familiar gleam in his eyes, he said nothing further. There is a playful aspect in my boss's character which can be found in human children but tends to get lost as they grow up. It was such a pleasure to see it again in Jesus after weeks of fear and dreadful anticipation. "Why?" I asked, reasserting Jesus' question. "I need to speak to Peter first," the son said. "What about John?" I suggested, putting in a bid for the only one of the 12 who'd been with Jesus all the way to Calvary. "He was there, you know." "I know," Jesus smiled. "That's why I need to speak to Peter first." Our conversation moved on to details of the son's incarceration and death and the story of how he'd broken free from its stifling constraints and spoken to all the souls held captive there. He told us how he had offered them the gift of heavenly freedom, but his story had barely begun when John came sprinting up the hill into the garden, followed at some distance by the older and less energetic form of Peter. John stopped at the step down into the tomb, looking in. Peter, when he finally arrived, stumbled straight inside. John followed. The liberated souls of the dead, who were still streaming out, looked curiously at the two men who were stood staring at Jesus' abandoned grave clothes. Watching them, it was quite clear why Jesus wanted to speak to Peter first. John was calm. He remembered Jesus' words about rising again and believed that it had indeed happened, even though he couldn't understand exactly what it meant. Peter's mind, on the other hand, was spinning. All manner of irrational thoughts were cascading through his head. He feared that even Jesus' dead body could not bear to be in the company of a man who had denied knowing him 3 times over. Jesus whispered to me, "Oriel, you direct John back to the others and I'll talk to Peter in private." I placed in the young man's mind a reminder that there were 9 others waiting anxiously in Jerusalem for a second opinion on Mary's report. He got the message, made his apologies to Peter and ran off. Peter did not want to stay alone in the dark. He staggered out of the garden and turned away from Jerusalem, closely followed by Jesus. "Wait for me here," Jesus called as he left.